All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stigma-Free Society's Facebook Live event. My name is Gerry Friesen, also known as a recovering farmer. I am a stress and conflict management specialist working out of Manitoba. Because of my own journey with mental illness, I have a real passion in talking about it because it is in talking to others we can find a path forward for ourselves. You can learn more about me by visiting gerryfriesen.ca. Through this Facebook Live event, I am representing the Stigma-Free Society, which is a Canadian registered charity that aims to reduce stigma of all kinds with a focus on mental health. This event is part of their Rural Mental Wellness Toolkit, an online community-based mental health program that creates access to mental health education and peer support training, as well as practical and relatable resources for those living in rural and agricultural communities. You can find the toolkit at ruralmentalwellness.com, and I will repeat that again at the end of the show. Today, I'm excited to have the opportunity to chat with Tara Klager. Am I saying your last name right?
Close, Klager. Thank you.
Klager. Okay, perfect. Sorry, Tara. I was actually going to ask you that before we started because I had never used it, and I'm going, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, but thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Tara is a 48-year-old first-generation farmer, an Alberta transplant, and a Rust Belt refugee. Born and raised in southwestern Ontario, she's been a stay-at-home mom, worked her share of dead-end jobs, been a freelance writer, and now as an empty nester, she lives on a small regenerative farm northwest of Cochrane, Alberta, on Treaty 7 land, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda, and Métis Region 3. Tara's goal is to build community through her work on the farm. Providence Lane Homestead is community first, always, whatever that may look like. I had the opportunity of meeting Tara, it's probably about a month ago now when she contacted me, and we chatted a few times, and I was really interested in the work you do, Tara, so I'm happy to have you on the show today. So again, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's talk about this. It sounds interesting when you talk about dead-end jobs, and now you're a freelance writer and you have this farm that you have a connection to community. So your path to where you are today might not seem straightforward to most. Can you begin by explaining to our audience how you got into farming and agriculture?
Well, actually, I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a really small farm in southwestern Ontario in a really small town called Ayr. My grandfather was the manager of the local co-op and feed stores there. And so I grew up with my grandparents, my parents, a couple of aunts and uncles, and on the farm. And we raised our own beef, and we had a 1-acre garden, and this was that was how I grew up. And I lived there until I think I was around 10 or 11 years old, and it was idyllic. It was it was the best way to grow up. Education was really prized, and my grandpa and my grandma were very community minded. They're very involved politically through their church, in their small community, but also in politics. And so we constantly had floods of people in and out, missionaries, visiting pastors, union organizers, people who were on strike, all this stuff, foster kids constantly on a flow through our house. And that's sort of how it all kind of got started for me. And when I got married, I moved around a lot. We moved to the farm here in 2015, but it was our 13th move. And we covered like 3 different provinces. And I've always been kind of looking to recreate that childhood home, where you feel safe and people are coming in and out, and it's exciting to be there, but it's also a refuge from the world. And so when we got to the farm here, I had horses and gradually started adding, and now we are an animal welfare approved, actually, fiber farm with sheep and alpacas, and we kind of work in that area of regenerative farming and animal welfare standards.
Oh, that sounds so good. I find it interesting when you talk about a farm being a refuge. I know in our previous conversation, I will have told you about, when I look back at farming, some of the regrets I might have but certainly my wife always reminds me what a great privilege it was to be able to raise our kids on the farm. And of course, I was raised on the farm, and like you say, it is a refuge and certainly beneficial for that type of lifestyle.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was, I mean, my favorite memories as a kid, remember my grandpa pushing me on the swing and him putting me on on his shoulders to go feed the Herefords, my little fistful of dandelions or
Yeah,
whatever, and,
yeah,
stuff
yeah.
like that.
Well, a lot of those experiences certainly you don't have when you grow up or live in an urban area. So
For
it's
sure.
cool to have those types of memory. But what does it mean to you to build community on your farm? I like that term, but I'm curious what you mean with that.
For me, community is just the word I use when I mean connection. I want to have as many connections. I sort of I think of the farm as being kind of like the center of a spider web, and all of there's 100,000 different paths in, but once you're in the center, there's really only one place, right? And so I want those connections to run out from the farm, but also for those connections to connect with each other in around the circumference of the farm and the periphery of the farm. So we work really hard to prioritize our relationships with Indigenous people through the Calgary Friendship Center. Um, we've had lots of opportunities to connect with public through various workshops, specifically around fiber and animal welfare standards. We also have participated in open farm days where people just come and they just sit in a field full of wildflowers or take pictures of the lambs or eat a sandwich in the shade, whatever it looks like. I really want to give people that opportunity to connect with the farm in some way that makes sense for them and based on their experience. Most of the time, I'm really just trying to get out of the way and let them do their thing in a safe way because this is a working farm. So we're not a hobby farm, it's a working farm. So, I want obviously everyone to be safe, but we really do prioritize allowing people to interact with the space and interact with the land and the animals on it in a way that makes sense to them based on the experiences that they have. And sometimes, especially if you have families who are coming, as we did when we did open farm days, who are new immigrants to Canada, this context is completely different to them. It's completely strange and completely unusual. And when you look at some of the statistics around farming in Canada, our our farms are vast, massive. But if you look at globally the statistics for the average size of a working farm, they're like 2 hectares.
Yeah.
That's the norm. We are the freaks, and that's the norm. So, it's an interesting thing when you welcome people who aren't from here originally, and then suddenly they're in a space and place that's completely different from their own experience of agriculture and farming, and you have an opportunity to interact with them and kind of help them humanize, make it human scale, and build those connections both back to the farm and then hopefully with each other.
Oh, that sounds good. Now I'm going to ask you a question, and,
Okay.
and I'm going to tell you it's for our audience's purposes, but it's actually for me.
Okay,
Can
I'm
you
ready.
can you define regenerative farming for me?
I can define my version of it.
Okay.
So there is no one agreed upon regenerative farming definition. It includes a lot of different practices. And, a lot of the words you'll hear are permaculture or holistic management or rotational grazing or biodiversity or soil regeneration. And all those things are part of regenerative farming, but they're not limited to those things. So for us, for instance, we do a lot in the space of permaculture, which is just a word that's been made of two other words, permanent agriculture smashed together. And that's the framework that we kind of started with. But other people do different things. At the end of the day, the goal is to leave the land in better condition than you found it,
Okay.
with no or very limited conventional inputs like tillage or chemicals, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Makes sense.
Hopefully.
Oh, it does. Absolutely. So tell me, how does or what do you see the main stressors being for folks or that folks are facing in the agricultural community?
Well, I can kind of only speak to my own experience, and I'm obviously informed by being a 48-year-old white woman. That makes it sort of limited. But I guess there's two things. The first one I would say would be just sort of the vast overarching sense of uncertainty that comes with this lifestyle. You don't know if it's going to rain. You don't know if you're going to get the prices that you need. You don't know if you're going to be paying more than you did the previous year and what that's going to do to your margins. You don't know if the bank's coming after you or if you're going back to the bank. It's that uncertainty. We lived in New Brunswick for a number of years, and while there, I heard the same thing from people who are commercial fishermen, who were, owning their own boats and didn't know if they get the quota and didn't know if the lobster would be there and didn't know what the price. So it's sort of like the same kind of feeling, and that sort of overarching sense of uncertainty. It's hard to make plans. It's hard to be certain that you're going to be able to do what set and achieve goals. Sometimes very basic goals, like, can I go on vacation, like camping? Can I put some money in the RESP for the kids, like, that kind of stuff. The other one I would say is, and I think this is more than agriculture, it's isolation. It's a sense of loneliness and feeling like you're against it and nobody understands. I had a friend who sent me a meme a while ago, and he says, tell me one other industry that you can work 80 hours a week, make a product that you sell for pennies on the dollars to a public that thinks you're trying to kill them, and there is that. So there's this sense of isolation, like it's us against them and us against the public. And I really hope that by building community and being transparent with the things that we do here, that we're helping to combat some of that, or at least provide a forum where those conversations can be had. I think there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of misunderstanding, and that isn't going to be improved without a concerted effort at communication.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it was interesting when you talked about things outside of our control, and particularly weather. And before we went on, you and I were chatting, and you told me that your forecast for your area was 10 to 20 centimeters of snow, and I was just horrified and said, "No, please," because we've had so much. And you said, "Yeah, but you guys need it." And so you're absolutely right. There's these things that are just totally outside of the control of farmers that they depend on.
Absolutely.
And I remember when I was farming and facing some significant financial challenges, I would often think, what I'm producing will feed so many people, and yet I'm having a tough time feeding myself, right? And so these are the things that farmers often deal with. So there's that, and the fact, and you alluded to it, that farmers have to, on an annual basis, seemingly, they have to make more and more decisions because there's more and more choices out there, and each decision can have such a big impact on, like you said, on margins, and how all of that starts feeling very overwhelming.
Oh, for sure. Like you're drinking out of the fire hose.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, I think for the kind of thing that we do, I'm able to take sort of like a chunk of December and a chunk of January just to kind of come down, like decompress, before I have to start ramping up again as we get ready for lambing and stuff like that. And that time to unplug my brain from the farm beyond like the maintenance stuff, making sure that hay bales go where they need to go, it's absolutely invaluable, because without that, I feel like I'd be running on this, what is that stress hormone? That one just would be constantly flushing through my head, and I need that break.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other one, and I just need to reiterate this because, and the pandemic has really brought that out, not just for farmers, but other people as well, is the isolation piece, the being lonely piece. Farms are getting further and further apart. Back in the day, you would run into a neighbor just doing your daily work pretty much. And so we're being spread further apart. We're isolated. And then when we start running into challenges, we have a tendency to isolate ourselves even more. And And yeah, that's something that people have to be so aware of.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I think when winter is 10 months of the year, where I am, and the pandemic for sure has exacerbated that. But there is that sort of, I don't know, that tendency to turtle, like just
Yeah.
curl in on yourself and stuff. And it becomes easy to do that. Like you get good at doing that. And you need to discipline yourself to engage with your community. Again, it comes back to community, whether it's, the people on either side of you or people who don't, generally aren't part of your worldview or whatever, however that looks, whatever that ends up being, and whatever your point of entry might be, whether it's a school or your church or whatever it is, or even just getting coffee with the guys down at the hardware store, whatever it is, you need to discipline yourself to do it, even when you don't feel like it.
Yeah, and you know what? I did that last week, Tara. I have to tell you this little story is because I've been sitting in this office, in this chair, in front of this computer for 2 years doing my work. And like you say, we kind of turtle and this is what we're used to. And last week I had to, and it was a 20-minute drive for me. I had to get in my car and it almost felt overwhelming.
Yeah.
You
Too much
know, you're,
stimulation coming at you.
yeah, and you're going, how will I do this? And I used to drive thousands of kilometers a year, and now I was finding this difficult. And yet, after I had made the trip, an hour later, I got home, and it felt so good.
Mm-hmm.
I had been out, the sun was shining. I hadn't talked to people I knew, but I had been in a couple of businesses and just interacted with whether it's a cashier or the person pumping my gas, and
Yeah.
and and even that human connection just reiterated for me again how important it is for us as humans to interact.
Oh, community is, I'm sorry, my cat's here. Hang on just a sec. Community is everything. I mean, I think my mom says that remember, you're a houseplant with complicated emotions. Get enough sunshine, and community is everything. And I find too, like when you're when it's really tough to be you for whatever reason, maybe something's going on the farm or in your family or whatever, when it's really, really hard, that's when you need to be really, really purposeful, really, really intentional about getting out. My dad, a number of years ago, had a very serious heart condition, and they couldn't let him leave the hospital. And so he's a very busy person. He's a very people person, and so he was bored out of his mind in the hospital. And so he was walking through a bigger ward one day, and he saw these men who were standing there, and they had, they were lying in bed. They weren't able to get out of bed. He at least was able to walk around, but these guys weren't allowed to get out of bed. So Dad went out and he got a bucket and some rags and some warm water, and he washed their feet, and he put moisturizer on their feet and got fresh socks for them. And his perspective has always been, no matter how bad it is for you, it's worse for someone else somewhere. Go find them and do something for them, and you'll both feel better.
Yeah.
So between mom, get enough sunshine, and dad, go find someone and do something of use to that person. When things are really tough, that's when we need to be even more deliberate, more disciplined, more intentional about making those connections.
Yeah. You talked about a brain chemical. We have one that's called oxytocin, and that one is a natural stress buster we have in our brains, and it releases when we connect with other people. And when you talk about what your dad did, that's one way of releasing that. And I could spend half an hour chatting with you about that, but we best move on. So, and this is what I was looking forward to talking to you about, Tara. Not that her stuff wasn't interesting, but here we go.
Okay.
You and I recently chatted about addictions in agriculture. So what have you discovered in your research?
Well, first off, I discovered addiction is sort of the end stage of something they call substance use disorder. That addiction is sort of the end of the line, but there's a ton of behaviors and stuff that come before you get to addiction. And so when I was speaking to different experts and different people who this is their area of expertise and this is where they work, the thing that came up over and over again was how little we know about substance use disorder in agricultural settings. We have some general ideas, like we know that Canadians drink a lot. It is by global standards, we're in the top 3. Like we drink a lot.
Oh,
and
really?
yeah, and so we have we drink more than most, and we know that rural populations drink more than urban ones do. And we know that Canadian farmers experience anxiety and depression in greater numbers than those who are not farmers. And we know that alcohol is a factor in 25 to 30% of completed suicides. But beyond that, we have no studies in Canada. Most of the data that I was looking at for the article came from either the United States or Australia. There is nothing specific to agriculture and substance use disorder in Canada. And I don't understand that, given everything that we do know about mental health in the agricultural sector. I don't know why it's a black hole when it comes to data.
Well, and it's interesting when you say that, because, and I think I mentioned this to you, is that I'm involved with someone on another organization that used to be with the Canadian Agricultural Safety Association, and also the lack of data there, because obviously a lot of this is tied to safety as well, right?
Absolutely.
And so I know, and you said it, that, and in fact, I should mention it again, that survey that Dr. Andrea Jones-Bitten did a few years ago that showed that farmers that they surveyed, out of 1,100, 58% would have qualified for an anxiety classification, which means that should they go see a professional, they'd be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, which is a number, every time I say it, it still alarms me, because that's a huge number.
Yeah.
And anxiety is such an insidious thing that people deal with. I was honest with you when we talked that I had used alcohol in the past to calm my anxiety, which, when alcohol leaves the body, of course, it magnifies that anxiety. And so to combat that, you drink more, right? And so I suspect, as you've found out, that a lot of people use alcohol to cope.
Well, I think as we were talking, one of the quotes that came up was, "I don't have a drinking problem. I have a life problem. Drinking is my solution." And people do things because it works. People don't do stuff if there's not a payoff. You do it because it works. The problem is that it only works for so long, and then you have a problem that can kill you.
Yeah.
And I think that the Canadian Association for Mental Health, they have some really great resources. But I mean, as we were speaking before the call, before we went live, I think one of the hardest and most challenging things for a lot of people to stand by and watch it happen when there's nothing you can do. And there's no way you can't make choices for somebody else. You didn't cause it, you can't cure it. So what can you do? And there are some great resources online. There's actually a great set of tutorials that are available where kids can say when mom and dad drink too much and stuff like that are available, and they're Canadian. So there are resources out there online for people to look at, but unfortunately, a lot of them are not agricultural centric, and that's where some of the usefulness, for lack, or application maybe, breaks down. I can't take time off if I'm lambing. Like, unless the therapist wants to see me in the barn, that's the only option. So, and it's the same if you're combining, or if you're planting, or if you're putting up hay, or whatever it is that you're doing. You can't take time off. You can't step away. And so you have people who are not just dealing with disorders, but now you're adding layers of burnout, you're adding layers of substance use disorder, and it just becomes this horrible self-perpetuating cycle. And sometimes, when you get into something like that, you're circling the drain, and it takes something truly cataclysmic to pull you out, and it's unfortunate it comes to that.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I know the Stigma-Free Society does a great job of, dare I say, combating the stigma out there regarding mental health. I've talked to a lot of experts on that. When you were looking into this topic, is there a stigma around that whole alcohol abuse stuff as well? Like, people don't want to talk about it, don't want to admit?
It usually, so one of the therapists I spoke to mentioned that she sees people when they hit crisis. like when they can no longer function. They functioned, and maybe they functioned very well for a number of years, but you can't do that forever. The one of the wheels starts to wobble, and eventually the whole thing stops running. So she'll see them when they're in crisis, when the damage that's being done to themselves, being done to the people around them, has already had a real chance to take root. And so you have not just chemical issues, but you have behavioral issues, you have social issues, and all of these things need to be undone. And it becomes a lot of, for lack of a better term, a lot of work. It is gut-wrenching, hard work. And and the work has to be done. Without the work being done, the healing can't happen. And so it's, there is a stigma, I think, around the idea of not being enough, not being able to hold it together. There's stigma around, between the person who needs the help and the person, maybe they don't like the look of or think the background is appropriate of the person that they're seeing, that urban versus rural thing. There's stigma in your own community. The therapist mentioned that she knows people who will travel 100 kilometers to go to an AA meeting because there's nobody who knows them there. And maintaining some kind of dignity and anonymity in small towns is really hard. Everybody knows already. If you drink to excess, let me break it down for you. Everybody knows.
Okay. You're talking to someone that knows that as well. So,
but there is that illusion of wanting to maintain some kind of anonymity, and so the layers of stigma are entrenched, and they're profound, and they exist not just within the community or within the family that requires support, but also where they're going to potentially get support. So yeah, there is a lot of stigma.
So, and just almost in summary, so as a farmer, as a person, I use alcohol to cope, to help me overcome some of the challenges I have in life. And then as you sink into that, now you're starting to deal with shame and guilt because you know darn well that you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. And now you're also hurting those close to you. And so that just exasperates the whole thing again.
Exactly. And it becomes very self-defeating. There is there is that kind of headspace where I've already done so much damage. Is it going to matter? Kind of thing. And I think if there was one thing I could say to people is that there is never so much damage that you're not valuable. There is never so much damage that you don't have a story that's worth sharing. In another life, I used to work with addicts and runaways. And I don't care where you come from. I don't care how bad it got. I care about you as a person, and the story you have to share might be a story that saves somebody else. We all have our angels, and those people who come alongside us and say the right word at the right moment for whatever reason. That's what we needed to hear that moment, and it helped us turn our boat around for whatever reason.
Yeah. Sorry, I was a little distracted here because I had to make a note of something you just said. I want to remember that, and my memory is that good. So.
That's okay. I don't retain anything anymore anyway, so I write it down.
Okay, so you know what? Again, half an hour is almost by, so here's a last question for you. What do you do personally to stay mentally healthy?
I say no a lot.
Good for you.
Well, and it's something that I learned. It's like, and sometimes it's something I really believe in, but it just doesn't work for whatever reason. I can't commit to it. So if I have to say no, and it's something I'm really passionate about, I'll come back and say, ask me a question I can say yes to. I have to say no to this. Ask me a question I can say yes to. So being transparent with people, giving them your parameters, telling them, having a good idea of your own limitations, knowing when you need rest, listening to your friends and family when they're saying to you, like, you're not real pleasant to be around right now. That's a cue to slow down, step back, and use some of that self-discipline and self-love for yourself to kind of get over some of those things. So I learned how to say no. And when I have to, because I believe strongly in something, I will say, ask me a question I can say yes to.
That's really cool. I like that. Because I often say, you know what? People, when I challenge people to use stress busters or, reduce their stress, I say they have to learn to say no. And that's something, I certainly haven't learned to do, and I know I need to. So that's so good to hear.
Well, I have some great examples of people who, when you prioritize people and relationships, you learn really quickly, really fast, what kinds of people and relationships are going to be, you can be most valuable in, like where you can do the most good and where you can have the most impact, but only if you still have some juice left in your battery.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're a paperweight.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now I want you, because I only jotted down half of what it was you said.
Okay, you're going to ask me to remember something?
I want you to repeat this, because I think that's a perfect way to close this off. You said there is never so much damage that
you're not valuable,
that you're
that
not
you don't
valuable.
have something to contribute. Yeah, there is never, nobody is utterly damaged. Nobody.
I love that. Tara, I think that's just a perfect way to close this off. Thank you so much for joining me today. I meet the most amazing people doing this, and I've now added you to that list. I've had a great time conversing with you today, as I did a month ago or a few weeks ago as well. So thanks again for joining us. Your insights into mental health and wellness certainly have resonated with me, as I'm sure they have with your audience. And so again, there is never so much damage that you're not valuable. I want people to remember that, because I think that's a great way, again, to close this off. So again, it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to reach out for help. If you're struggling today, make sure you reach out and talk about it. Also, please avail yourself of the many resources available in the Rural Mental Wellness Toolkit, which can be found at ruralmentalwellness.com. So till next time, stay safe and stay well. And thanks again, Tara.
Thank you so much.